Hey everyone, welcome to Yoga Land's Yoga Teacher Companion. I'm your host, Jason Crandell. There are two related questions that I get about backbending all the time. And I want to unpack these two questions. I want to let you see the relationship between these two questions. And then finally, I want to tell you, I think they're almost irrelevant questions. That there's a different question that we need to be asking ourselves. And if you're listening, if I were listening, I'd be like, what are the questions? Here are the questions. Question number one, should you internally rotate the thighs or externally rotate the thighs in backbends? That's question one. Question two, should you anteriorly tilt your pelvis or posteriorly tilt your pelvis when you backbend? Those are the two questions. They're inextricably related questions. So we're going to see how those two questions are actually the same question, just with kind of a different nuance. And then I want to tell you first why I don't think that's the right question to ask. I want to tell you what I think the right question to ask about backbending actually is, which is, how do you want to feel when you do your backbend? Okay? Here's why this is important. The technique is not the end goal. Okay, hear that again. The technique is not the end goal in a yoga pose. I'm not trying to execute a technique in a yoga pose. I'm trying to experience a state of being. So what do I want to experience in backbends? When I teach you, what do I want you to experience in backbends? I know the answer to that question. I want myself and I want you to experience an even and sustainable curve in the lower back, the mid back, and the upper back. I want you, since it's a yoga practice, to feel even. Lower back, mid back, upper back. Not one part too much, not one part too little. That's the question. So the question should actually be, what do we do with our pelvis and what do we do with our thighs to feel more integrated, to feel more even in our spine and our backbends? And the answer to me is, well, it's really going to depend. There are going to be some people that are going to prefer anterior pelvic tilt with internal rotation. We'll look at that. There are going to be some people that prefer posterior pelvic tilt with external rotation or keeping those thighs neutral. So I don't want to say, do this technique or do that technique. I want to say, let's understand the technique. And let's understand how the technique affects a body. And then let's experiment on our practice and figure out which one of those techniques helps us arrive at how we actually want to feel in the backbend. Okay? So what I want to do now really quickly is see how the rotation of the femurs affects the tilt of the pelvis. This is really simple. This is really straightforward. And everyone, this is empirical. This relationship is categorical. It's across populations. So I'm going to stand up, okay? So what's going to happen when you internally rotate your femurs? So those of you watching, when you internally rotate your femurs, and you can do this with me if you're in a reasonable position to do it, right? When you internally rotate your femurs, turn them in, turn them in, turn them in, turn them in, and you let your pelvis go with it. You don't fight with the pelvis, you let the pelvis go with it. When you internally rotate your femurs, you will create anterior pelvic tilt. The front rim of the pelvis will start to rock forward towards the front of the thighs. So internally rotating the thighs helps produce anterior pelvic tilt. Right? So we kind of see like, anterior pelvic tilt and internal rotation, those pair with each other. They're not the exact same thing, but they might as well be the same thing in terms of answering and responding to these technical backbend questions. Now, conversely, externally rotating the femurs, right? So if I stand here and I externally rotate the femurs and I let my pelvis go with it, right? If I fight with my pelvis, if I fight with my spine, or if I just work to hold my pelvis and spine fixed, then I can rotate my femurs independently, okay? So yes, you can rotate your femurs independently of your pelvis, but you really have to try to do that. There's a natural rhythm, there's a natural cohesiveness that when you externally rotate your femurs, that produces posterior pelvic tilt. And when you internally rotate your femurs, that tends to produce anterior pelvic tilt, okay? So now we kind of get to the question, which is not how to rotate the femurs, but does anterior pelvic tilt or does posterior pelvic tilt work better in backbends? Well, let me make the case for why both options are good options and why both options sometimes don't work for people, okay? So what we want to arrive at is not which one of these techniques should we employ, but how are these techniques different? What are the advantages of these techniques? And then why do each one of these techniques, why do they make some people struggle? So that we can find the right technique for the right person, okay? So really simple, everyone. The case for anterior pelvic tilt in backbends is really straightforward. And you can probably, everyone, even just sitting where you are, even if you're just sitting watching this, right, or sitting listening to this, so long as you're sitting up, what you can do is keep your torso upright, right? So you want to keep that upright quality of torso. Don't forward fold. Keep the torso upright. Take your hands to your hips, or just watch me as I do it. And then just a little bit, anteriorly tilt the pelvis, right? And again, you're not forward bending. You keep your torso over the upright. Now, if you tilt the pelvic rim forward, so if you anteriorly tilt the pelvis, right? Keep the torso upright, but keep doing that, keep doing it, keep doing it. What are you going to feel? As you anteriorly tilt the pelvis, you are going to increase spinal extension from bottom to top. When you anteriorly tilt the pelvis, the lower back and the middle back, but also the upper back, are going to move a little bit more into the back bend. So if I am looking to create more expansiveness of my thoracic spine, my upper back and back bends, which FYI, I am, it makes sense to anteriorly tilt the pelvis, right? Because anteriorly tilting the pelvis contributes to the whole spine moving into extension, including that lift and that kind of buoyancy of the chest. Great. Now, let's look at the opposite, posterior pelvic tilt. So if you posteriorly tilt your pelvis, and again, we're not really doing a back bend yet. I'm going to show this in bridge, and then if you want to do it with me in bridge, you can do it. But it's not like this is going to be a lead instructional class, okay? So you got your hands on your hips, and you're sitting, you're keeping your torso upright, okay? And now just kind of let the torso go with it, and with your hands on your hips, if you posteriorly tilt the pelvis, so if you rotate the pelvis backwards on the thighs, or another way of thinking about this is tucking the tailbone or drawing the hip points, the anterior hip points up away from the thighs. If you do those actions, what does that do to the spine? What does it do to the chest? It rounds it, right? If I posteriorly tilt the pelvis, that is going to take the spine actually towards flexion, and it's going to drop the chest, which theoretically is the opposite of what I want from a back bend. So case closed. Case closed. When you do a back bend, you should anteriorly tilt the pelvis. Not so much, not so fast. Here's why. Let's see it in just bridge pose, okay? So when I do bridge pose, right, I lay back, right, I set my feet however I want to set my feet. Remember, we've had another session, another podcast. If you haven't already watched about different ways of positioning the feet, make sure to check that out, okay? So if in my back bend, so if in bridge, I go up in bridge, and as I go up, I anteriorly tilt my pelvis, I'm able to move my spine into greater extension, right? I'm able to move my spine into greater extension by anteriorly tilting my pelvis. But for many people, even though this is logical and on paper totally reasonable, for many people, when you anteriorly tilt the pelvis, yes, you do take the spine into greater extension, but for a lot of people, you disproportionately take the lower back into extension, and that creates compression. So for many people, anterior pelvic tilts is preferable in their backbends. Because when they anteriorly tilt their pelvis, the whole spine moves into a deeper backbend and they get that thoracic volume that works, and it doesn't compress their lower back. But for other people, that anterior pelvic tilt, even though it's theoretically a totally reasonable thing, can create a lot of compression in the lumbar, especially for people that have a lot of lumbar mobility, but not much thoracic mobility and not much core control. So the downside of anterior pelvic tilt for some is lumbar compression. So now let's start to take a step back and let's start to remember, oh, well, does that mean that posteriorly tilting the pelvis works really well for some? And the answer is, yeah, it works really well for some. So if I come into bridge pose, and I'm doing bridge pose, and again, because it's like, this isn't a huge pose, these are not visually dramatic changes, especially with my body, because I don't have a ton of range of motion in these poses. But right now, if you're watching me, I'm doing a little bit of anterior pelvic tilt. And my lower back, it does actually feel compressed. My lower back, middle back, and upper back, they don't feel even. The amount of sensation and demand in my lower back is significantly disproportionate to the other parts of my spine, which is not what I am looking for as a teacher or a practitioner. So now what I'm gonna do, instead of anteriorly tilting my pelvis, is now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna focus on a little posterior pelvic tilt, or a little bit of lengthening the buttock towards the back of the knees. Or another way of saying it is I'm gonna draw my hip points towards my chest. So as I do that posterior pelvic tilt, what that does for me and for many students is it allows the back bend to maintain, but it decompresses the lower back. The lower back is still in extension, it's still doing a back bend, but it's lessened it, okay? So here's kind of my bottom line, okay? We can listen to this teacher who is so awesome and amazing say you gotta anteriorly tilt. And it's gonna make sense for many students. And there's a logic to it. It's not incorrect, it's totally sensible. And we'll listen to another teacher that's also totally sensible that says keep the pelvis neutral or posteriorly tilt the pelvis. And that also makes sense for a lot of students. That posterior pelvic tilt tends to decompress the lumbar spine. But for me, my goal is for us to see, especially as teachers, well, these are just two different techniques that are both viable. And some of my students may thrive with anterior tilt because that helps them get more spinal extension and it doesn't bother the lower back. But then some students in that anterior pelvic tilt are getting too much lumbar compression, so those students tend to need to keep the pelvis neutral or a little posterior pelvic tilt. Now listen, I wish it was as simple as saying everyone across population should do technique X and then they'll be fine. But the reality is not everyone thrives under the same technical environment. And so we don't want to think to ourselves, should we do this or should we do that? We want to think, what's the outcome? And then what are the tools to help different people with different bodies achieve those outcomes, okay? So to me, if I'm you and I'm just kind of getting this and processing this, I get down on the mat. At some point, maybe not now, whenever it works for you, play with this, right? Experiment with anterior tilt, posterior tilt, feel how it feels in your body. And then I think you're gonna start to really see that there is a way for you to help all of your students find that right pelvic position. You can kind of think about your pelvis, everyone's pelvis is a little bit of a steering wheel in the pose. And depending on what direction someone's facing, you might have to turn the steering wheel one way or another way to get into that, that central zone where everything feels cohesive, okay? But if we know that we're looking for cohesiveness and that we have multiple techniques, then we remember the technique is not the end goal. The technique is the vehicle to get us to the end goal of evenness.